waited 2 more months because 29 people signed up for the program, and we're not quite 29 people yet. This is, okay, is that okay? Just wait?
Yes,
sure.
of course.
You want to just let us know when we should
I'll
start?
turn and go, ta-da!
Testing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I probably won't point towards me because I have such a quiet voice. So, yeah.
Oh, you guys are sharing one? Do you want to share mine? And do you?
No,
Are
it's
you
okay.
sure?
Yeah, we'll be
Okay.
fine. Because all we have to do is lean over. Yeah. Rotate.
Oh, you have notes.
I can't remember anything lately. Yeah, well, I think, because this book came out in August, so I've done a few events like this, yeah. Yeah, it was nice. I always enjoy it, and I always enjoy the conversation because it almost always goes someplace that you didn't necessarily plan out, and that's what is fabulous about it.
When did it come out?
August.
August of last year. Yeah, mine was December. And you're what month?
Oh, July.
July. So we're all no, you're not a debut, but we all last year these books came out. So I think that's how they do it too. Is they want like a current book, like when you sign up for a festival or you pitch a festival, they like that. Yeah. When did yours come out?
Last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How come you're not a part of this festival?
So I did give you a bunch of talks, but mostly kind of more academic.
Yeah.
I just came back from Penn State.
Oh, nice.
I did talk in English department there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
When you had the novel question, I have a colleague at Utah who's like obsessed with the novel and the genealogy of the novel and what is the romance versus the novel genre, and so I got where you were coming from. Those conversations about it, but as a form.
So you write in this speculative fiction.
Yeah.
Because it's not a typical genre that I read. So, but I've been enjoying reading out some. I mean, you should.
I actually did a reading last week at BYU, which I'd never been down there before, and I was changing all the swear words in it. I didn't have to, but having grown up there and being very familiar with the culture, I just felt like it was the most respectful thing to do, honestly. And like, I'm not like, this isn't my career, like I'm not married. They were just, they weren't all over the place. It wasn't like really necessary for the styles, so it was just like one or two. But
I guess everything is recorded here, which is kind of nice.
Do you know if they're posting it somewhere?
I'm sorry?
Do you know if they're posting the recordings or?
I think probably on the
yeah,
website.
I was actually, because
At some point,
UV,
but I'm
which
not
is
sure.
like, I have a friend, one of my neighbors, professor of feminist philosophy there, and like it is really hard, because, and even I have Mormon students who want me to
It's
censor
kind of a walk to hear.
I know you're an adult, you can censor yourself.
But the architecture is amazing.
But yes, but like, no, this, it has, sexual assault and all these, and the conversation, the questions that they asked were really like diving into that, not avoiding it. And so I was kind of thrilled in that way, and happy for them too, that was the atmosphere. So, it did start with an opening prayer, which was a new experience for me, to be at a reading and start with prayer. I was just glad they didn't ask me to like give it. It is, yeah. We're
last time we had one of those gigantic rooms, and we wouldn't normally have this many chairs.
Yeah.
So it makes it look like nobody's here.
Yeah.
But really, there are people here. I just want you to know that.
There are people here. There's
No
some-
worries.
There's a guy that looks like my nephew.
They were.
Did you make that sweater, Nancy?
No, I bought it at a thrift shop.
Oh, it's beautiful. It looks
Yes.
homemade. Yeah.
I get all my clothes.
Yeah. That's a good spot to get them.
Cheap thrill shop. Well, this one came from, actually, I think twice as nice. I keep saying second, it's twice as nice.
I get these.
Yeah.
Is that in the mall?
No, it's on Preston Avenue, but it's walkable from the mall if you're in the
Mood
mood.
to shop.
But there's not, well, there is a thrift shop in the mall. Darling?
There's a couple, yeah.
Are you staying on me?
I'm at the Residence Inn, just right here. Yeah.
So are you all staying?
At the Residence Inn here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they ran out of room when I booked it.
We're glad to hear it.
Okay, we'll start now. Thank you everyone for coming on such a beautiful day. My name is Sadie Hoagland, and I am welcoming you to our panel entitled Teenage Wasteland. I have a little spiel. The Virginia Festival of the Book is a program of Virginia Humanities, a statewide organization whose mission is to connect people and ideas to explore the human experience. Most festival events are free of charge, but not free to produce. Your support helps us keep this incredible event going year after year. And if you'd like to support the festival, you can give using one of the QR codes, designated QR codes found in the back of your brochure. And in terms of support, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Book's premier sponsor, Michelle and David Baldacci, who helped make this event possible. And before we begin, maybe you all want to silence your cell phones. And I'm told to make you aware of this space, the exits, and if there's any kind of emergency, there's plenty of site coordinators. I also wanted to let you know that at the conclusion of this panel, a bookseller will be on site with copies of the author's latest books. And purchasing a book is a great way to support our authors, and they're here. They can sign your copy too, which is a bonus. And finally, I need to say that the festival authors and speakers represent themselves. They do not represent Virginia Humanities or the University of Virginia. So I'm so delighted now to welcome the authors. The authors are Rosa Kwon Easton in the middle, Sadie Hoagland here, and Phoebe Lowe over there, who goes by P.H. Lowe. One of our authors, Esinam Bediako, could not be here. She's in the program, but she couldn't be here because of illness. So I'll start with Rosa. Rosa was born in Seoul, Korea. She holds a bachelor's degree in government from Smith College, a master's in international and public affairs from Columbia University, and a JD from Boston College Law School. She is a lawyer and an elected trustee of the Palos Verdes Library District in sunny Southern California, she says. I think I'll go ahead and I'll introduce all the panelists, and then I'll sort of lay out what the format is. Sadie, to my left here, is the author of Circle of Animals, among several other books. She has a PhD in fiction from the University of Utah and is the recipient of several fellowships. Her work has earned extensive recognition, including 4 Pushcart Prize nominations from 2015 to 2018, and she currently teaches at the University of Utah. Phoebe Loh at the end is a Riesling and Locus-nominated Malaysian American writer and poet whose debut novel, These Deathless Stories, is now out from Orbit Books and Angry Robot, a UK publisher. Their shorter work is published in Strange Horizons, Reactor, Fantasy Magazine, and Diabolical Plots, among others. So the format is that I'm going to give each of the authors some minutes to present whatever they like. In most cases, I believe, read from their works, right? And then I have some questions to get the conversation started amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. So we will start then with Rosa. Oh. Did you not want to start? We can.
No, it's fine.
We can switch it up for sure.
It's always hard to go first.
And I'll keep time.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to my novel, which is my debut novel. It's called White Mulberry. It's inspired by the life of my own grandmother, a young woman coming of age in 1930s. Japan occupied Korea. It follows the journey of Myung, an 11-year-old girl who has dreams that are too big for her small farming village outside Pyongyang, which is now North Korea. And so when she gets the opportunity to further her education and avoid an arranged marriage, she follows her older sister to Japan in hopes of a better future. But once she arrives, she discovers that she must pass as Japanese to survive in a society rife with anti-Korean sentiment. This is a novel where a woman is torn between 2 identities, and it's a story of resilience, love, and the power of identity. So I'm just going to read a few pages to put you in the mood or set you in the story a little bit. And so it starts in 1928, Pyongan Province, Northern Korea. The afternoon sun beat down on the yard where a sole mulberry tree shaded a small house from the summer heat. Behind the glossy veined leaves, Myung sat perched on her usual bough, scanning the vista of thatched roof farms dotting her village. She was stretching her neck, searching for some sweet berries to eat, when she spotted someone moving below. A stranger in a beige uniform and boots paced back and forth along the back wall. He stopped abruptly when he eyed her older sister, Bobe, who was tossing squash peels to the chickens. Myung stiffened, gripping the thick, scaly bark with her fingernails. Once, she had seen some young men at the market staring at her sister like this, like she was something they wanted to own. While Boba had blushed at the men's attention, Myung had thrust herself into their view. Born in the year of the dragon, she was ready to fight. Even at 11 years old, she would torch this enemy with her fire breath and swat him with her mighty tail. The stranger fanned his face with his cap. Was he a Japanese soldier, like the one she'd seen at Pyongyang Station snatching a bag of steaming chestnuts from a poor street vendor? Maybe this man was sizing up their house to rob them. Father said the Japanese had stolen his parents' farm after they took over Korea almost 20 years ago, so it was possible. She wished Father were here to confront the man, but he wouldn't be visiting for another month. His house was in the next village, a 2-hour walk away, and he was busy with his first wife and Myung's other half-siblings. Myung looked around for Mother and caught sight of her cone straw hat in the garden next to the barley field where she was picking yellow chame melon. Mother must have noticed the stranger too, because she looked up toward the house, straightened her back, and dusted off her hands. Then she limped toward him, dragging her bad leg like a sack of millet. Is that time? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we will go to Sadie. Yes, of course, please.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to my fellow panelists too. This is a real honor to be up here. My latest book is Circle of Animals, and Circle of Animals is the translation of the Greek word zodiac. So you can kind of picture the circle of animals, stars in the sky. That's a big thematic in the book. It ties together the mother and daughter that are central to the book through stories of Greek mythology that the mother tells the daughter, and then the constellation on the front is Cassiopeia. And you're not close enough, I can't give you extra credit for naming it because you're too far away to see it. The book takes place in Marin County, California, San Francisco, and the Monterey Bay area. And it follows Skye, who's a 28-year-old working in landscape architecture in stonemasonry, which is a really male-dominated business. And at the beginning of the book, she experiences an assault at her workplace, and she discovers that Edie, her mother, is missing. And I say missing in quotes because Edie is like super free-willed, hippie spirit, like kind of always doing her own thing. So Skye isn't totally clear what's going on, but she decides that because of what's happened at work, she's going to take a leave of absence so she can figure out what to do and also to find her mother. So that sets her off on a journey where she meets her estranged grandmother and learns all sorts of things about her mother's past and even her own past when she was very young. And this sort of raises her character kind of has a crisis where she has to think about who she is in relation to the generations that came before her and who she wants to be. So a lot of the thematic has to do with female agency and generational trauma and navigating that. And so, and also counterculture, like California counterculture is really fascinating to me. So that's big in the book as well, which is, as you can tell from the Zodiac. Okay, so I'm just gonna read from the beginning of the book, and this is only a few pages in, so not much has happened. And so, yes, Skye is the main character, Edie is the mother, and Janet is Edie's neighbor. When Skye got off work, there were 3 voicemails from her mother's neighbor, Janet. She groaned. The last time Janet had called, it was to tell her that her mother was sunbathing nude on the back stoop again, for even Jesus to see, as Janet had put it, and that if Skye couldn't come over and tuck a shirt on her, then she'd just have to call the police. Skye pulled out of the work parking lot and put the voicemails on speaker. 11:32 a.m. Skye, honey, it's me, Janet. Why don't you give me a call? 1 p.m. Skye, dear, it's Janet again. Listen, it's about your mother. That's why I'm calling, so call me just as soon as you get this. 4 p.m. Skye, it's Janet. Something very strange is happening at your mother's. For one, she's not there and hasn't been. I don't want to worry you, but maybe you should head over here and check it out. Skye groaned as she hung up and dialed her mother. This time straight to voicemail, like the phone was off or dead. Mom, it's me. Call me. Janet is on one again. She paused. I've been wanting to talk to you about something, too. She added this last part because it was true, because also it was an extra incentive for her mother to call her back. Also, when she did finally talk to her, her mother wouldn't accuse her of, quote, not having tried hard enough to tell her about it. In the meantime, she'd have to go over there. She sighed and switched lanes so she could head across the Golden Gate Bridge to her mother's house in Balboa Terrace. At least she'd be going against traffic, and the fog remained out in the bay, waiting until dark to let down its breathy hair and spread its tendrils over the bridge through the city. As she drove, she was irritated but not surprised. Her mother was probably just on another one of her whims, though it had been years since she called Skye from Reno or Oregon to say she'd hitched a ride or met a biker or really just, quote, had to get away from the repression of the city. Skye had assumed that phase was over, that she was settling into something like her age, but now she wasn't so sure. Her mother's neighborhood, Balboa Terrace, was eclectic. The hills were not quite as steep as in other parts of the city, and the streets were tightly lined with mostly stucco blockhouses in pastel colors, some with splotches of black mold and dead lawns, revealing the long-standing drought. But on every street there were a few small Victorian houses, and her mother's was one of these. Painted a Kelly green with white trim that was now chipping away in small, ragged horizons, it stood out. The porch was covered in potted plants, some alive, some dead. The bay breeze batted at a faded turquoise dream catcher. When Sky pulled up in front of it, Janet came out of her own perfectly white stucco hacienda style to meet her. She had a tight, pale face and wore a pink silk button-down with slacks. Her hair was white and styled flawlessly. When Sky was little, she used to sometimes want Janet for a mother. Janet, who was so nice and normal, and who made cookies without pot in them that kids could eat, and who seemed to pity Sky. It wasn't until she was older that she realized why her mother called Janet a bitch, which was when she realized that the pity was really condescension. But she looked tired today and was wringing her hands as she approached Sky with what seemed like real concern. "Sky, honey, I called," she said. "I know," Sky got out of the car. "That's why I'm here." She gave Janet a half hug out of habit. Janet hooked her arm and led her up the steps to her mother's door as she started talking. "Well, honey, let's see, it was almost a week ago, late in the night, and I noticed that your mother's lights were on, like every single one of them. I thought it was strange, but thought maybe she was up cleaning or something. I know she said she was having sleeping problems lately, so I didn't think too much of it. I left to go see the grandkids in Santa Clara the next morning, but then I didn't get back until last night, 5 days later, and all the same lights are on, and they stayed on all night and all day. I knocked and rang too, but no answer. I've tried her cell like 100 times, but no answer. So I really just want to make sure she's all right, so I called you." Sky listened as they walked up the steps to her mother's house. Janet was right. She could see a strange number of lights wrong, considering it wasn't yet dark, and considering her mother only ever had one on at a time. She tried the door as Janet said, "It's locked." Then she rang the bell. As she sat there waiting for a respectful minute before getting her key out, she noticed a stir inside her, a strange and unsettling feeling. It reminded her of the feeling of sitting in the dark of a theater right before the show begins, the anticipation she got when her mother cooked up some new and wild plan. She hadn't felt this way in years, but still she recognized the way in which the excitement was short-lived and was immediately followed by dread. Thank you.
Thank you. And Phoebe, why don't you go ahead now?
Sure. Hi, so I don't have a copy, but my debut novel is called Deathless Shores. It is a fantasy novel. It's a gender-bent retelling of a Captain Hook origin story that follows a former lost boy who is kind of like kicked off like Peter's Island after she has her period and is discovered to be a girl. And after she is kicked out, she is kind of in withdrawal from the magic dust that they use on the island to fly. And so most of the story is kind of 9 years later when she's been kind of like treating this withdrawal with different, like a different drug outside, like outside the island in the real world. And that drug starts kind of taking its toll on her body, and so she decides to go back to the island to face Peter one last time on her own terms. Some themes I was playing with were like obviously gender and also kind of myth making, the way that we romanticize childhood, and a bit of like capitalism angst and colonialism in terms of, you know, like you've grown up and you can't have adventures anymore, like what do you do with your life? I'm going to read a little excerpt because this is called Teenage Wasteland. The excerpt is kind of a flashback to when the main character, Jordan, is 13, and she's just been like violently exiled from the island. It's actually told from the perspective of another character, Baron, who is also a lost boy who has just left the island, but he has a very different perspective on sort of like what they've both just experienced and kind of growing up. Okay. Oh, sorry. And I guess for some context, like they're in a hospital because she was kind of like attacked, like set upon by the Lost Boys after she was kind of discovered. So. The first time he had seen Jordan after the island, those 9 years ago, after her period and the boys' attack, a toothpaste green hospital gown had been draped over her shoulders, her right arm stitched up and furiously swollen beneath the plasticky sleeve. She glared at him, taking in his crisp button-down, his wire-rimmed spectacles, and he'd felt the sudden urge to run out and change back into island furs. "Hello," he said, and winced. His voice had changed all the way. It had occasionally cracked on the island, but he let down his guard here after a few days of hearing his father speak. Had forgotten about the boys giggling, the quick twist of Jordan's mouth on the edge of disdain. "Where's your dust?" she asked. His hand lifted automatically to his neck, a lighter line of skin all around, coalescing in a patch on his collarbone, where his pouch of golden dust had once hung. He dumped its contents the moment his feet touched outside ground. "I'm moving on," he wanted to say, the words flickering on the tip of his tongue. "I want to grow up and work at an office and never think about the island again. Come with me." Instead, he said simply, "It's gone. You got rid of it." An accusation. He shrugged, fiddling with the buttons of his shirt cuffs. "I hope we can still be friends," he added, only half joking. She glared. "You're giving up." "That's kind of how it works, though, isn't it?" It came out more defensive than he'd intended. "We have our fun, we grow up, we leave. And it's not like we had that much to give up on now that we," a harsh laugh escaped her, and she doubled over with a sound halfway between a cough and a retch. Barron thrust out the basin lying by her cot, and she vomited something clear and slimy. For the first time since his return, he was truly afraid. The Lost Boys each played sick, perhaps once a season, when they wanted a little extra attention, begged for hot chocolate as their mother dabbed their foreheads with warm rags, snuggled into the giant bed as she spooned pretend medicine between their coy pink lips. But they had always sprung up better the next morning, tired of their little fantasies of dependence, had always rejected any weakness that would last. He knew Jordan didn't want his pity. One sympathetic look, one too polite inquiry about her infection or the antibiotics, and he would lose what little of her esteem he had managed to maintain. Would become just another uptight grown-up, trying to quiet her for his own comfort. But they were no longer Lost Boys either. He thought, traitorously, he didn't know what to say. "We don't have anything to give up on," Jordan continued, wiping her mouth with the back of her fist. "But I'm going back." Her own neck was bare as well. He assumed the nurses had thrown her pouch away when they brought her in. But there had to be other ways to return to the island. He did not doubt she would find one. He set the basin back on the floor. "If that's what you want." She looked at him sharply. "What do you want, Barron?" I don't know," he said, his face warming. "To be happy, I guess." Jordan laughed again, and the bitterness in her face was 100 years old. "Well, good luck."
Thank you. Thank you for those tantalizing excerpts. And I had some questions to start the conversation here, as I was saying before we open it up to all of you. And the first question I had for all three writers, really, is whether there was an experience or an idea which really you feel brought you to the writing of this book. And however you want to answer is fine.
Here I go again first. The inspiration, I think, for my novel came when I was a junior in college, so that was 40 years ago. And I studied abroad in Kyoto and discovered that I had another side of my family, a Korean family who lived in Japan. And I was curious about how my family ended up there, and what their lives were like. I'm an immigrant from Seoul, Korea, and I came when I was 7, so I was curious about how their experience as immigrants differed from mine in America. So when I returned back to California, my grandmother was living with us at the time, and I started asking her questions about her life and why my father was born there and why she returned to Korea. And I discovered 2 documents, and being a lawyer, I was very interested in documents. They were her nursing and midwife certificates from dated 1938 and 1939, and they were written in Japanese, but it had her Korean surname on it. And she told me later that she had to pretend that she was Japanese in order to get that job, and in order to get an education and improve her circumstances by denying her Korean identity because of the racial persecution that was happening in Japan at the time during the occupation. So that was 40 years ago, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. I interviewed my grandmother numerous times before she passed away, and she didn't want to talk about her childhood and what happened at first, but I was slowly able to find out more about her past. And I wrote a memoir version, a family memoir version of her story first. But I found that there were too many gaps that I couldn't really fill. And I also wanted to enrich the story and find out for myself, who she was as a person. And that required me to sort of peel back the layers and go back to her childhood. And that's when the story begins, and that's why I'm on this panel, because she was a teenager when she had to make these life-changing decisions and under difficult circumstances. So that's a long way of saying it started a long time ago.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful, in fact, you've answered all of my questions, but I'll adjust for sure.
I can elaborate on some
That's
other
okay.
aspect.
Phoebe, did you want to respond to that question?
Sure. Yeah, so the premise for my book kind of crystallized when I was reading the original Peter Pan, I think just out of curiosity. And I was really struck by not only the blatant racism and sexism, but also just kind of the ways that childhood is like glorified. It's held up as this, this sacred thing that's a tragedy to lose. And, like, kind of joke, it's like virginity, where like, you're like on this pedestal, you're like, you're innocent, you're pure, you're like, your life is full of play and whimsy, and then suddenly you hit 18 and bam, you're like, you're a horrible person, you're like the villain. Sorry. So that was kind of what got me thinking about that, and just the ways that still kind of permeates our culture, and like, whether it's like, adults' pursuit of like youthful appearance, or just like the ways that kids are kind of still held up like, rhetorically as this, like, oh, they are, we cannot corrupt them, and things like that. And then I guess another line of thought that I was kind of playing with was, like, I guess if you remember any of like, whether it's like the Disney Peter Pan or like the original, it's very like, there is a sort of, like there's a mainstream aspect to this conceptualization of childhood. So like, in order to be able to, have a carefree, innocent stage of your life, there's like, a certain, shelteredness, a certain like normalization, like like certain assumptions are made about that child's experience. And so I wanted to play with, like what happens when you are like a person of color in America and you don't have that experience for like whatever reasons, or you're like queer and not able to express it, or you're neurodivergent or disabled or like what have you. And so you kind of age straight from like not getting that child experience to becoming the villain. And so I wanted to explore that idea from, a perspective that could kind of examine the darker implications of that.
Thank you. Sadie, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah, with this book, I actually started working with the mother, daughter, grandmother characters, that sort of concept, when I was living in California doing my master's degree, so about 10 years before I actually wrote this book. And what drew me to that relationship was two things. One is that I think that's a really complex and intense relationship, the mother-daughter relationship, and part of it is because there's so much love there, but there's also this kind of like, and this is kind of probably where the teenage part comes in, like trying to make yourself an individual against what came before you and define your own identity within the framework of your family, but also as an individual. And then I also was really fascinated just by sort of the evolution of what it means to be female in this country in the last 100 years, so the last 3 or 4 generations, what was available to one generation in terms of both opportunity but also agency, and then 3 generations down, completely different. So I was really interested in thinking about that, and so the female agency part of the book was really important to me, as well as the ways in which the mother, daughter, and grandmother communicate and sometimes completely fail to communicate as well. So, and then I'm also just like, my mom went to college in the 60s in San Francisco, and I've always been really fascinated with California during that time. The music that was coming out, there was like a ton of cults, and there was like weird amount of serial killers. It was just like a fascinating point. There's no serial killers in the book, don't worry. But it was just a fascinating part of history that I was really interested in learning about. So it's sort of combining those two fascinations into this story.
Well, I guess this was touched on a little bit by all of you, the theme of the panel, Teenage Wasteland. And I wanted to know if you wanted, perhaps you could reflect on that a little further. So Teenage Wasteland, one could get very metaphorical with it. I sense, Phoebe, that it's not about innocence, right? But I wonder if there are other ways that I know it's not a thematic you all chose, but it's one that you were organized into, and I just wondered if and how it was generative. Good.
So I think part of when I think about narrative a lot, and that's sort of, I'm always thinking about how trauma affects narrative, but I also think about narrative as really key to our identity. Being able to say where you're from, what you are, is really important. And I think that part of being a teenager is coming up with that narrative, again, both for yourself but against what came before you. But I'll also say that I think part of that experience of growing up, and is certainly happening with Sky in this book, is like really having that moment where you understand that your parents are people. Like, you're like, oh wait, they had a childhood, and like really like that big aha moment where even though cognitively you've known that your whole life, you really start to understand the context within which you were raised and the stories that you were born into. And so I think for me, part of that teenage aspect is both of those kinds of growths that happen in that time period.
Are you interested in that question?
Yeah, sure. So I thought it was a really funny title, just because, I don't know, there's like kind of a punk feel to it. I guess for my book, I thought it was interesting too, because so I kind of grew up like reading young adult fiction, and it was pretty important to me that the main characters in my book were over 18, just because there is that, like in so many cultures, there's this sort of like, you're an adult, and I think like in our culture, like 18 is a big number. And then also if you are in the young adult sphere, like 90% of the characters are like 16 or 17. So I wanted to have characters who were kind of outside that bracket, but like still going through similar kind of like, search for identity, or sort of like what comes next, what does it mean to be like a person in the world that's kind of, maybe different from the story that you were told as a child. But yeah, so it was, I think, like I wanted to show, or like kind of represent, characters who exist in this, kind of like in this register, but like aren't 16 and 17. Just kind of like, thinking about it as more of a spectrum rather than like, you hit this, you're out of the gate, you're like expected to belong to like this other narrative now, and kind of like, pushing those boundaries in that way.
Interesting.
Listening to my fellow panelists speak, now I really understand why we were brought together, because I think we do have a lot of themes in common. I think for my book, the coming of age years, at the years when you, like Sadie was saying, you differentiate yourself from your family of origin and where you came from. I experienced that myself growing up as an immigrant and wondering, where do I really belong? My family of origin is Korean. I live in America. When we first arrived, I didn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, and so I embraced my Americanness. But as I got older, I think I've always been curious about, well, what self did I leave behind? What did I sacrifice? What was sacrificed by our displacement, our movement from one culture to another? So I explored that in my book in a way that I don't think I could have in a family memoir. It was to be able to fictionalize and imagine my grandmother sort of undergoing a similar experience that I did growing up, and that's how I drew those scenes. The first day of school, what her life would have been like as an immigrant from Korea to Japan. It was a wasteland. I mean, I think it came from the Who song. I looked it up, and it wasn't even called Teenage Wasteland. It's actually called Baba O'Reilly is the name of the song. Absolutely. And it's about being wasted. It's about like your mom's era of being wasted, but in but not your mom. But I do also explore mother-daughter relationships and in the circumstances of a period of time where girls were not allowed to have an education beyond primary school, and their greatest hope was to marry somebody who had money or had the ability to support her financially. And so there were a lot of arranged marriages. But I know my grandmother was very interested in education, and she wanted female agency and wanted to determine her future for herself. And she was a role model to me as I was growing up. And my favorite book growing up actually was called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. I don't know if you've read that. That's why the title of my novel is White Mulberry. I chose a tree because even though that novel was about a poor Irish girl coming of age in Brooklyn in the 1900s, it was reflective of my own journey. And through writing this book, I realized was my grandmother's journey too.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to just ask one last one before we open it up, because I often feel like it's such a treat to hear writers talk about whom they imagine as their readers. And so I did want to get that in before I open it up, and I wondered if any of you want to comment on that. Did you want to go, Phoebe, or are you ready? You don't have to, yeah.
Sure. I guess, so my book is pretty firmly in sort of like the fantasy, like speculative fiction space, so I did kind of imagine like playing with those tropes in a way that, people who are kind of in that world might recognize as like kind of trying to flip them upside down. I guess I'm also, like, another audience members is like me. Like, I spent 7 years on this book, and like things that I kind of wanted to see in the world. And then also just, like, I think something that, so in the past maybe 10 years, there's been a lot of growth, I think, in terms of, you know, like people of color being represented in publishing, like their stories being like more, you know, like bought by bigger publishers, like put out there, like marketed, etc. But I think like for me, because I grew up like, you know, diaspora experience of like I grew up in the U.S. Like with a lot of, you know, American like Western stories, like British stories, but like I kind of, so I guess like for context, like a lot of the people of color, authors of color who get published, like there's like really great representation of you know, like fantasy that's based on like the mythology of like ancient China or like you know, things like that, and so like I think that's like really cool that like those stories are getting put out there. But I think like for myself, like I did not grow up with any of that, and so I really wrote this book to like have that, you know, like characters that looked like me, but in, you know, like it's like we exist here too, right? Like we are kind of, you know, like these stories are like the stories that we also grew up with, and kind of like again sort of the blurring of the boundaries or like inserting the representation where like it kind of hasn't been as much, although I think it also is growing as well. So.
Did you, either of you
Sure,
want to?
sure. Well, I think my audience is a little more simple maybe than Phoebe's. I imagine anybody who has felt marginalized or outside, like an outsider, who struggle with belonging and acceptance in a majority society. Those are sort of more generic, the generic audience, but I think more specifically, my agent actually asked me to do, maybe the question is, who did I intend my audience to be and who did it end up sort of morphing into?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I always wrote it for someone like me, really, who didn't have stories like this growing up, and but I imagined them to the audience to be interested in stories of family and motherhood, coming of age, secrets, history. So again, it's sort of more generic, but if you put like a person, you know, type of person to it, I think it would be appealing to immigrants and mothers and avid history, people who are interested in history. So I don't know. I mean, I think now as I'm writing my sequel, I'm thinking about my audience more because Stein on writing, or there's lots of writing books that say thinking about your audience is really probably the most important thing an author can do when they're writing. So I think it will be a similar audience that I'm writing to in my sequel. But I hope I think everyone could get something out of it.
I was just gonna say that's a lot of us that you've mentioned there.
Maybe that's too broad.
And I think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful. Did you want to speak to that, Sadie?
Yeah, sure. So when I'm thinking of my audience, I didn't, by the way, at first when I started writing, and that was not a great thing. Because I was like, I'm just going to do whatever I want with language. And then there would be this, what's this question of how is the reader going to follow 9 characters that all have the name that starts with M. So I started to think about it a lot more as I began to teach the craft of writing and as I began to write more. And now I sort of think of the reader as this kind of imaginary like archetype of a reader, and I always think of this person as slightly bored and like critical too. So I'm always like, okay, this reader's just like yeah, exactly. They're gonna throw my book across the room at this point if I do this. And so for me, that's incentive to create doorways in my work constantly for the reader. I also had the privilege of teaching a course on the literary mystery, and during that course, my students and I sort of formulated this thesis that that the mystery, because it's a whodunit, is like an epistemological project. It's about knowledge, and so then I started to think about the reader as sort of always on a quest for knowledge, and that you as the writer have that knowledge. It doesn't have to be a whodunit; it can be whatever, but you know something that the reader doesn't from page 1 to the end, and that throughout the book, I think a lot about what does the reader know right now? What do they need to know? And what can I wait a little bit and make them excited to learn later? So I think about that sort of scale of knowledge and that sort of bridge of knowledge between the reader and I quite a lot, and that's helpful to me as a writer.
Thank you. I love the metaphor of the doorway in writing. That's lovely. Let me open up the door and ask if there are questions all of you would like to ask of the writers. Yes, please.
I'd like to ask each, I actually have two questions. One, do you read current young adult fiction, and if so, what's the best thing you've read lately? And two, how much input did you have into the map? I teach 8th grade, and we're doing maps right now, and I always tell them authors don't necessarily get final say-so about cover art and maps, and they don't believe me. So prove that I'm right.
Yeah, cool. So I kind of shifted more toward reading adult in the past few years, but I do have a lot of friends who write YA, so like I read their books a lot. I really enjoyed The Dark We Know by Wenyi Lee. It's it's set in like a small southern kind of coded town, and it's sort of, there's like voices coming from the mountains and sort of like secrets in the main character's past, so it's really, I found it really compelling, and also has similar themes to these other shores of like kind of growing up and what does it mean to like leave a place behind. And I also really enjoyed Midnights with You by Claire Osanko. It's a contemporary young adult, and it's about like Filipina girl who can't sleep at night and kind of goes on these late night driving lessons with her neighbor. So it's a lot of fun. It also like made me cry a lot. So it's like so I really enjoyed that one. And then for the map, I did get some input. Like they asked me for a little sketch, and I'm not like an artist, so I just kind of like give the outline, and then I also added there's like annotations you'll see in the map, so I added those, but some of the other touches were just sort of like the artist came up with. He was really attached to, there's flamingos. He was really attached to the flamingos. I'm like, there are no flamingos in the book, but he like wanted to keep them, and so there's this theme, like the island is sort of an amalgamation of like many stories, like in the real world, like there's so many versions of Peter Pan. So the island is sort of this amalgamation, and so maybe in some of the versions there are flamingos, but then the version that the main character Jordan experienced, like she's like, there's no flamingos here. So like that's kind of the purpose of the annotation part. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Each of your books, just from the excerpts, seem like they're very character-driven. And I'm just interested to know if there was a particular character that was difficult for you to write, and how you overcame that.
Thank you.
Oh gosh. Character difficult to write. Yeah.
The mother character for me was a little difficult to write because she's very different than my mother, which is good. But I also was really trying to disrupt the idea of, even though she didn't fit the mold, as you heard from that little excerpt, of like what an ideal mother would be like, or what a really sort of typical, stereotypical mother of in the 70s when Sky was younger would have been like. She still did things that were really deep gestures of love. And so trying to figure out ways to express both her immaturity as a character, which is rooted in a trauma, but also her sort of really deep love, even though she shows it in really odd ways to her daughter. And so that was kind of just always kind of hard, because for Sky's experience as a child, it feels like, oh, really up and down, and some days this, some days that, but then also trying to make her still redeemable and something that the readers would find compassion for. So that was a challenge, to kind of figure out this character who's growing, but also in a very complicated context.
Yeah. I would say that the sister character for me was the hardest to write, and maybe because I didn't have a sister growing up. One of the, I had a cultural sensitivity reader read my novel, and there was that the sister's husband ends up becoming an alcoholic, and there's some allegations of spousal abuse. But they didn't talk about it, the sisters, and I kept thinking, like, if I had a sister, would I tell her, and when would I tell her, and it wasn't so much of that I think was hard to write, but it was when my editor said, you know, because I said, the Myung, the main character here, she hears that her sister's going to have a baby, and so she's super excited, and her sister is excited too. And her sister says something like, "Oh, your husband's going to definitely improve now. You know, he's so happy." And she agrees, and I kind of left it at that. And the sensitivity reader said, you know, somebody reading this who's had abuse in the family might not think that it rings true. So I was freaking out, because I'd have to unspool that whole thread in the book, and it's hard to do. So the editor made the suggestion, well, why don't you just cast doubt on it, you know, like in her own mind. So the character said, oh, sister, you know, that's great. But she herself was thinking, let's see about that and see if he really changes. But, you know, even then it's like, would the sister have told her, you know, like, so I think that was my limitation, because I didn't have that direct experience of being a sister, although I think the sisterly bond was really close. So, yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to develop the characters where you don't have that relationship. You haven't had that relationship. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there another question? Yes, please.
So, all of your characters are of various ages, but your stories are about growing up, my question is, how do you make these characters grow with reflective in a way that they can be understood by audiences of different ages?
The question is about characters who go through different periods of their lives and how they're represented and experienced in that way. Yeah. Somebody interested in that question?
Can I just had a thought. I think I chose this age because when I interviewed my grandmother, she was in her 80s and 90s, and so I could have chosen a part of her life. In fact, I started the novel thinking that I would start it when she was 26, when she had to confront this really important decision, make this decision about life and death, really. But I kept wondering, like, well, why does she make the decision that she does? It has to come from way far back and to her childhood. And so I think the turning point, one of the major turning points in human development is the transition between being a teenager and an adult. And I think so much happened to her at that time that was the pivotal moment. And my novel spans from when she's 11 to 26, so she's really straddling that transition from childhood to adulthood. And I think we all go through that experience in sort of a similar developmental way. So that's why I chose that period, if that was your question.
I'll just answer this from a craft perspective, which is that I think that having sort of scene doubles or these kinds of ways in which you circle back to things with the characters. So in my book, there's a moment where Sky is at work and she like literally cannot talk. Like words are not coming out. And so by the end of the book, she returns and says what she needs to say. And so that like is a really clear way to see like this is the exact same situation, but the character has completely changed. And I think there's lots of ways like from a craft perspective that you can do that are a little bit more subtle than that as well, that just show these shifts of like, and you don't even have to have two, you can have 3 or 4, where the character is constantly presented with some version of the same opportunity to show growth, and then eventually they do.
Yeah, I guess like in terms of making that stage kind of like accessible to readers of all ages, I think like maybe also from a craft perspective, I try to focus a lot on like why a character does something and like how they feel, and like even though maybe their decisions are impulsive, like kind of building up the the momentum or like the impetus, like in my book, like the main character is sort of like in this like shitty apartment, has like a boss who's like very coercive, and is like really desperate to get out of that situation. And also the like dust withdrawal, there's sort of a medication, healthcare dimension. Like people don't believe her when she says she's in withdrawal from this like substance that doesn't exist. And so like I think like kind of building up those reasons, like hopefully it's sort of like even if a reader is not in their 20s, like I've had some reviews that are like, oh, this brought me back to a time when I like cared about things, but like just like having enough grounding so that like anyone can understand, like they remember being in a shitty apartment, or they like have that like visceral reaction to something, even if they're not maybe like directly at that stage of development.
Thank you. I think we could spend all afternoon talking about these wonderful books with these wonderful authors, but we are going to close, and you all have an opportunity to purchase the books, and even more exciting, get the authors to sign the books if you would like, in the room sort of in the back to the side over here. I was asked to say that the Virginia Festival of the Book is very interested in your feedback, and that's what's so wonderful about this festival. It's very participatory and always changing, and I think there may be a QR code in the back of your brochure, so this is just to encourage you to, it's not like the, leaving a restaurant, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I feel like this is a little bit more interesting and important to give feedback for this purpose. Huh? Yeah. So please join me in thanking the authors. Thank you for coming.